Yeah, well, so thank you for joining me again. And I guess my first question is a little more personal, if you don't mind me asking. So, like, what inspired you to enter the archaeological field?
When I was 17, I was an exchange student with American Field Service, which is an organization that sends students from the US to countries all over the world and from countries all over the world to the US. And that summer, they sent some students to an excavation rather than to stay with a family in another country. So I was sent to an excavation north of Rome in an Etruscan cemetery near Cerveteri uh, for 1 month, and then 1 month in Calabria in at an early medieval site. And so I excavated for 2 months during that summer when I was 17, and that convinced me that archaeology would be an interesting field to enter.
Wow. Yeah, that's really cool. So, talking about like a little more recently in your career, so what does your work at UPenn involve? I know you're involved with the museum as well, right?
Yeah, I have a joint appointment. In addition to being a professor in the classical studies department, I'm curator in charge of the Mediterranean section. So my work is half and half between the university and the museum. And then I also direct excavations at Gordian in West Central Turkey.
Hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask you a little bit about your archaeological field work. Like maybe could you talk a little bit about maybe your most recent field work or something you found more interesting, maybe relating to Greece if you've had any?
Well, altogether, I've been digging in Turkey every summer for the last 42 years. So 5 years at the site of Aphrodisias in southwest Turkey. Then I co-directed excavations at Troy for 25 years. And now I've been director or co-director of excavations at Gordian since 2007. This past summer, we were excavating on the Citadel Mound of Gordian, which is a mound of 9 superimposed settlements like Troy, spanning a period of 4,000 years from the early Bronze Age through the late Byzantine period. And we excavated a complex that I think was the site of the cart connected to the knot that was cut by Alexander the Great at Gordian in 333
Wow.
BC. So that's the latest excavation project of note that connects to Greece.
Wow. And I mean, as you might have read, my like what I like to focus on is like cultural preservation. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess you're someone that's very important to interview because you work both in the field and the museum. So could you talk a little bit about your how what you do to ensure cultural preservation and during your field work?
During field work, well, we spend over 50% of our time each summer on architectural conservation. This is at the request of the Republic of Turkey. So, with the monuments that were excavated at Gordian in the past, and excavation started in 1950, there were no steps taken to ensure the preservation of the walls that they uncovered, which were badly damaged in a fire in 800 BC. So, we spend, again, over 50% of our time on the conservation of those walls, ensuring that they will last for the next century at least. Then we have a cultural heritage education program for children in the area where we teach them about cultural heritage importance, the importance of the ancient civilizations in West Central Turkey and in Turkey in general, as well as giving them an overview of what we do to conserve the monuments that we find, in the hope that they will acquire the same kind of respect for the preservation of cultural heritage that we have ourselves. So
Mm.
we involve the local community extensively in our work with an eye toward ensuring the preservation of what we find.
Wow, yeah, I think that's very important. So, like, kind of like switching gears, right? You also work in the museum, and what can the different challenges be that you've seen in a museum relating to cultural preservations? Like, how does cultural preservation in the museum differ from your field work?
Well, we have an extensive conservation department in the museum focused on conserving the 1 million objects in our collection. As a museum, we're connected to a number of outreach projects focused on conservation. So I'm on the advisory board of the Institute for the Cultural Heritage of Iraq, based in Erbil. So we train Iraqi conservators in the best conservation techniques possible and try to give them access to the best materials for conservation. I started a cultural heritage cultural heritage protection training program for U.S. soldiers that were deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as Syria. So for about 14 years, I would go to military bases and give the soldiers briefings, classes on cultural heritage protection, the basics of conservation. And I did that as well in the field in Iraq and Afghanistan with the soldiers that were based there, that had deployed there. And then I also lectured to ROTC programs in the Philadelphia area on cultural heritage protection. So we do a lot of lecturing on cultural heritage protection to a lot of different groups, especially those that are going to go to areas of armed conflict where cultural heritage is in danger.
Yeah, I was just wondering like what you think that the average person can do to help ensure preservation, like especially in places like Greece and Turkey and Italy where there's so many artifacts and there's so many people that don't really know about about what to do with and to help protect them.
So the question is, what can the average person do to ensure conservation of cultural heritage? I mean, it starts at home. So there's a great deal of cultural heritage in the United States that people need to be concerned about preserving. And in order to do that, I suppose they need to ask themselves, what is cultural heritage? And in asking yourself, what is cultural heritage, I guess you need to ask yourself, what is history? And what of history should be preserved? This has been a fundamental question recently with the destruction of so many statues associated with the Civil War, especially in the southeast part of the United States. Are those historical documents? For me, those are historical documents. Should historical documents be conserved? As an archaeologist, for me, there is no excuse for the destruction of an historical document. If it is an historical document that incites racism, injustice, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, whatever it is, injustice of any kind, then are there occasions where you need to remove it from the site where it has typically been erected and put it somewhere else? There surely are such cases. These instances of statues from the Civil War are cases in point. I would use those as what I would call didactic tools. I would put them in museums. I would not destroy them. I would surround them with text panels that indicate how they had originally functioned in the history that had produced them and how they've been perceived over time, because obviously the way one perceives a monument changes as time goes by and as our viewpoints change as well. So I think we need to have a broader dialogue regarding what is cultural heritage in the United States and how we handle that. Is there ever an excuse for the destruction of a monument in the United States? Again, for me, there is no excuse for the destruction of history. History is messy. It's always been messy. It's been messy for the last 5,000 years. If you try to erase the messiness of history, then you've erased the history. And if you erase the history, then it's going to repeat itself in a fashion that's far more negative than what it had been initially. So these are larger questions, larger conversations that I think we need to have about cultural heritage, and that will help us adopt a policy for conserving them.